I'm Rachel Oldroyd, and I will be chairing this session. You've joined the Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar, and we are looking and talking about investigating the Israel-Hamas armed conflict today. I'm speaking to you from London, from the Guardian newspaper. I'm the Deputy Investigations Editor. It's my job to bring a bit of energy into this session, which is quite difficult because I'm talking to a computer screen, but hopefully I will be helped by my three great speakers. We've got three people lined up who have a lot of experience and are going to be sharing their tips and their challenges. We're going to be talking about how they've used their investigative skills to shine some light on the conflict. But first, let's just set ourselves into the zone and think about what impact this war has had. As I'm sure you're all aware, it's had a really terrible toll, killing more than 34,000 people since it began in October 7th, with an estimated 33,000 Palestinian deaths in Gaza and the West Bank, and 1,200 deaths in Israel. And among that huge number, at least 95 reporters have been killed, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. So people reporting from the ground, for them, any level of reporting, even existing, comes with an immense risk. There are also personal challenges that they're having to deal with daily, such as logistical challenges, the obstacles of lack of access to the internet, their inability to move freely. And for us on the outside, trying to report on this or investigate this, we are dealing with a tsunami of disinformation and dubious narratives. So, you know, this is a challenge that I'm sure you're all aware of, and in some ways it's a new level of challenge because things are happening so quickly on the ground too. It means that most of the investigation that is taking place around this conflict is being done by international media outlets. And we've had to rely heavily on geolocation, on analysing documents, on open source information. A lot of that information is not coming from reporters necessarily, but coming from bloggers and citizens that are living inside Gaza. And we're having to deal with aspects around checking this information that we are turning to. So there are many more challenges that we're having to face, and we'll cover quite a lot of them, and hopefully not just talk about the challenges, but provide some tips and some views on how you can get over these obstacles and produce some great reporting and investigation. Because that is being done. I mean, the positive thing to say here is that work is being done and work is coming out, and amazing work by the international media is being done. So to join me today, I'm delighted to introduce you to our three speakers. We have Sarah El-Deeb, who is joining us from Associated Press. She's been a journalist since the year 2000, and she has extensive experience of reporting on the Middle East. And she's also got investigative reporting experience. She joined AP's global investigative team in 2021, shortly before Russia launched its war on Ukraine. And she's part of the War Crimes Watch Ukraine project. She is the author of a chapter on finding the missing in GIJN's Reporter's Guide to Investigating War Crimes. And more recently, she has been investigating the Israel-Hamas conflict. So I'm sure she's going to be able to offer us up lots of good tips there. Also joining us is Peter Polak. He is a research-based designer and software developer from Forensic Architecture. This is a research agency based also here in London at Goldsmiths University of London. And he deploys with the team, he develops, employs and disseminates new techniques, methods and concepts for investigating state and corporate violence. He produces graphical and interactive digital media, and I'm sure you've all seen some of the work that Forensic Architecture have done on this conflict. And finally, we have Phil Rees, who is the Director of Investigative Journalism at Al Jazeera, and he's been there since 2013. Al Jazeera has been extensively covering the Israel-Hamas conflict. He has also presented or produced over 100 documentaries and reported on dozens of conflicts, ranging from Colombia to Cambodia to Belfast and to Iraq, and has done a lot of work in the Middle East. So thank you to our speakers for joining us. A little few bits of housekeeping and admin, just so all of you who've joined us, and we've got many people listening in today. So just a few things about the Global Investigative Journalism Network, for those of you who are not familiar with it. GIJN, as it's probably better known these days, is the largest global network of non-profit investigative journalism organizations. It has 250 member organizations across 91 countries. And it works with journalists everywhere. So not just its members, it works with non-profits, it works with commercial organizations and freelancers. It's got an extensive range of resources and tip sheets to help journalists worldwide, including many around this subject. So I really highly recommend that you go and take a look at their website and have a look post this event at all the things they've got to offer there. They really are amazing. A couple of other small points before I hand over to somebody else's voice. We've got interpreters today, which is great. We have interpreters in Arabic and French. So if you would like to use these services, please click on the interpretation button. You can find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So just a reminder for those of us joining whose first language is not English, if you would like interpretation in either Arabic or French, click on the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the language you would prefer. We've got about 75 minutes, a bit less now, but 70 minutes or so. We're going to hear from our three speakers. You'll have a bit of interjection from me in between those speakers. And then I really want to allow some time for questions from you. So please start thinking about things you would like to ask as we go along. You can post your questions at any point during the time. Enter them into the Q&A box, and then we will deal with them at the end. And a final reminder to everybody, just to let you know that we are recording this session. Okay, so I would like at this point to hand over to our first speaker. We've got Sarah starting. Sarah is joining us from Associated Press. Handing over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for having me, GIJN. And I'm speaking to you from Beirut. It's another front of this war, but Beirut is a little far from the south. So I'm in a good place, and I hope you can hear me well. And I will tell you about my experience covering this war. It's been, like Rachel said, one of the most challenging conflicts of recently to cover. And I think one of the biggest challenges, with all respect and admiration and to our colleagues on the ground, is that we're covering it remotely. We can't be there. So I think I'll just explain how I tried to deal with that. Let me share my screen. I hope I can get this right. Yeah. So I think we're getting started. All journalism has a certain degree of investigation in it. But when I joined the investigation team, I was privileged and was lucky to be allowed more time and space to spend more time on doing a particular report or story. And in this case, it often meant going through large amounts of data and working with teams to kind of process that data and look for patterns and trends in what's happening. And I think the war in Gaza has been challenging in this aspect in a big way because it was very difficult to find patterns. And I just want to be clear also, my presentation is about Gaza, not Israel, although I did cover some stories and reports in Israel earlier in the war, but I moved to Gaza, but this is a focus on Gaza primarily. And one of the main challenges has been just the scale of the war. I think, like Rachel was telling us, the numbers are just mind-boggling. And I think to get a sense, 9 days into the war, already 1 million people were displaced and over 2,000 people were killed, including 14 UN staff, which was also like unheard of in recent conflicts. I think Israel had said that it dropped about 6,000 bombs in the first 6 days in the war, and this is usually an amount used in a year. We've seen that in Afghanistan. Not that it's okay, but it was also that the span was that much different. And I think Rachel mentioned that nearly 2 weeks into the war, communication in Gaza was already shut down, and I think this is something. No, I think it was something that continued throughout the war. So getting contact with people has been immensely challenging. And then Gaza's been under siege since 2007, borders controlled by Israel and Egypt in a way, what goes in and what goes out. But after the war, everything stopped, water, electricity, no one was going in and out, and aid took a very long time to start trickling in and not at enough amount. And I think that's one of the things that we've been looking at. But also no reporters or independent investigators were allowed in. And now, like Rachel was saying, 200 days into the war, and these numbers continue to grow. But the magnitude and the scale of this war, we've seen all on the TV screens, and more importantly on social media. I think you couldn't escape it unless you wanted to. And this was definitely done by our colleagues on the ground who had no respite since the beginning of the war. But for me, this was, I mean, for me and I think I speak for a lot of my colleagues, but this was really challenging because how do I investigate war crimes, which has been one thing I've been working on for the last couple of years, even before I joined the investigation. With a war going with this scale and at this speed, for someone who's tried to verify the ferocity of the airstrikes and remotely, this pace meant that I couldn't find survivors who would spend time enough in the area to find scraps or shrapnel from what weapon was used to look at the evidence or what's left, what comes after a strike to try to determine what happened or what weapon was used or what bomb was dropped. There was also no one on the ground that was independently doing this, like who could go back to the place. So it was also very difficult. And no matter what the sample of my of the strikes that I was looking at, it was also very hard for them to be representative of what was going on because of the intensity of the ammunition and the war and the airstrikes deployed. So I think the other thing was also keeping up, like things were moving very quickly. It's always hard to keep up as a journalist, I think, but this was just going so fast and so many things were happening: displacement, destruction, fighting, starvation, aid needs, people moving from being moved, being forcefully moved, evacuated, the death toll at an incredible level. And I think tracking people and sources with the communication blackout was also very, very challenging. And people were not only without phones, but they also didn't have time for me. They were running for their lives. And eventually later on in the war, people were afraid of speaking often on record or on camera because they were worried about detention or ramification of what could happen to them after speaking to reporters. And then we have the contending narratives in this war. That was also another major challenge. So I think, like every place, we have to create teams. And I think, like, parts of the problem or the issues in working in the Middle East is that there's always a security concern or fear for the safety of the reporters or the sources you're talking to because of various crackdowns or permit denial or harassment. But in Gaza, literally people were running for their lives and they were looking for their family. I think Rachel spoke of that as well. So it was hard to ask my team, who are the news reporters on the ground, and we had a number, to actually go back to one area and try to look deeper or dig deeper and ask more people. So it was often what I can get. And that meant I had to reach out to other people, which is also often what we do in other environments. But I think in this case, it was also very challenging. The space is very small. Gaza is very small. The number of people trying to cover this war enormous. And I think it was also to make sure that you don't collaborate with someone who put their lives in danger or are not professional enough that you can get yourself as a reporter in trouble. I think that also meant you have to be on the phone all the time. Whenever the phone rings, you have to pick up, because they don't have communication, you have communication. So you have to make sure that you're available when your sources or your colleagues are calling. And I think as has been proven in other conflicts, it's very useful to work with other colleagues and other organizations to try to pool resources together. But I think in the Gaza war, it just made it a lot more essential and necessary to do that. And I think we're aware of the contending narratives over the war in Gaza. This is the largest number of casualties on both sides, not to compare, but I think in both sides, it's a large number of people killed. They've never seen this before. Israel says it has the right to self-defense. It also says that it's doing all it can to prevent civilian casualties, something that we're constantly assessing, because we don't see that. Like Rachel was saying, 14,000 of those killed were children, or 7,000 or more women were killed. So it was also something that we always constantly had to check. It says that Hamas is using the population as human shields, basically saying everyone in Gaza is reducing them to a single uniform entity, which was also difficult to deal with and work with at all times. But it was also difficult to assess what are the military targets in the area, because we're not on the ground. I think we also know that there's very little coverage of the crisis in Gaza on Israeli media. On the other hand, the Palestinians, for them, the October 7th was mainly explained as a response and a reaction to years of repression by the occupation, and there was little reporting on the flight of the hostages. So that was a tight space that we always had to work through when reporting any specific strike, say, or attack or alleged war crime. And I think it was no more clearer than in a health facility, in attacks on health facilities, that brought to sharp contrast this difficulty. I think there were hundreds of incidents of attacks on healthcare facilities since the beginning of the war. And while Israel says they're being used by militants, the militants deny they're using them. But the evidence presented so far have failed to explain or legitimize an attack on a medical facility that is not something that you see. It has a very high bar under international humanitarian law. And it was, again, difficult to reach civilians and patients who are in the area to try to get from them what was happening, or what they can what the testimonies they can give us. See, I'm a ground reporter. For me, a testimony and a witness testimony has a lot of value. I mean, I think for all reporters, but it's just for someone who's worked in Gaza before, lived in Gaza through some of the difficult days as well. It's just been an extra personal challenge, kind of having to report on specific incidents and explosions without having access to the ground. I think one of the examples was the explosion of Ahli Hospital on the 17th of October. It was a case that kind of proved or showcased the amount of difficulties that we reporters from remotely covering such war had to deal with. The evidence, we didn't have any shrapnel. The sources were mostly visual evidence from videos from different angles, different interpretation. And then we had the context of repeated threats and attacks on health facilities. But then there were variety of reports at the end that did not always agree. And I think it would be easy to see those, but I know that Peter is also going to speak a bit about attacks on health facilities. I'm sure he would get to explain how difficult it has been on that front. But if I wrap up and just tell you that I've been working on many stories for many months, and it takes a really long time to get witnesses, to get verification, to get response from authorities, and to deal with the fast pace of the war. I think one of the basic instruments that I found is just Excel sheets and folders. I have tons of them on my computer, on my, they have managed to keep me a little sane in keeping the flow of information organized. In the case of Gaza, having multiple phone numbers have also helped me, because I live in Lebanon. It's not easy to call Israel from here. The two countries are officially at war, but also the numbers keeps changing, the people keep moving. So that has helped me a lot, and it also drove me mad a little, because juggling 3 or 4 phones. And just to pay tribute to photographs, I think videos are often very center stage, but I just found that photographs have immense amount of information in them, and going back to them and talking to the photographers themselves has been a source of great information on specific incident and situations. And I've learned that, when I found that I'm gone out of my comfort zone a lot in this war. I spoke to people I've covered a lot of wars in this region, but never spoke to so many weapon experts like I have in this war. I think that has been very educational, and I have to say, I didn't see it coming, even though there's a lot of war. Weapons. And I think keeping a diary of, like, a work log of what I do every day has also managed to keep the whole pace and scale in check, because of just the number of phone calls you have to make a day and the number of people you have to follow up with. And something simple, just remember those people you spoke to, go back to them. I think it always helps. It helps you, it helps them, and it helps the report. Like Rich was saying at one point, I think this is, at the end of the day, we're trying to tell the story of what's happening. So the data and the numbers and the documents are nothing without the people that tell the story. And I think one other thing, from 7 months into this, and I have the luxury to do that, and I have the luxury to say that, but not my colleagues in Gaza. I think remember to rest. It's taking a toll on everyone. And just a few things. People will come back, people will question your story, and just be prepared to answer. Be prepared to question yourself and revet and vet what you've done and question your assumptions, but also trust your work. If you've done, you've done the work. And this is not over. There are lots of investigations going on, lots of prosecutors, lots of tribunals that are looking into this. So there's a lot more that we have to do. Thank you.
That was really moving, Sarah. Thank you very much. Thanks for setting the scene. Could I ask you to mute now, so that we don't get any echo for our listeners? Thank you. So as you heard, there are a lot of challenges that Sarah was talking about. I think one of the things that I've realised working with colleagues here at The Guardian, we've also done a lot of reporting on this conflict and a lot of investigation, is that many of these challenges we're facing are really new. And I think Sarah really set it out there, somebody who's been reporting on conflict for such a long time and has found this one exceptional in so many ways. She talked about the remoteness, obviously. I'm sure we'll hear that from other speakers, the speed at which it's happening, the level and scale at which it's happening, the fact that gathering evidence is extremely tricky, or hard evidence from the ground, tracking people, tracking sources, how do you tell stories, the narrative, how do you tell those stories when it's difficult to find people on the ground who will stay with you and keep talking you through the situation, and how do you keep your sources safe? I'm also, when I hear these things, when I hear from reporters like Sarah and investigators, it always amazes me that, and in this conflict in particular, that the amount of work and the amount of toll that these things take on our investigative journalists. I mean, we have the privilege of being able to report and investigate this conflict from afar, but it's clear that it still has a massive toll. And one of the big things that I think we should be thinking about, as we hear from our other speakers, is if this is an area that you are working on or are contemplating working on, then, as Sarah so perfectly put it, take rest, take time. It is really hard. It was really hard to hear from Sarah there that she has to be available all the time, because people in Gaza are trying to contact you as journalists, and they have limited windows when they can make the communication. So being available, having to pick your phone up every single minute and revisit and get back into the space and talk to people, these to all take their tolls. So I think my big takeaway from Sarah's 10 minutes there was time and rest. They are really key to helping you tackle this challenge. We're moving on to our second speaker now. We've got Peter Polak, who's joining us from Forensic Architecture. As I mentioned, he's been doing lots of work in this area, lots of investigative work. So hopefully he will provide some great tips about how you can go about digging into this conflict. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Sarah, for starting. Thank you to the Global Investigative Journalism Network for inviting us and for thinking about us. And thank you, everybody that was able to join. Let me try to share my screen now. Hopefully everybody can see this. So I thought I could depend on my colleagues here to talk about the journalistic stakes of what's going on. And I thought that because my background is less in journalism per se, I could focus more on some of the technical things that we're doing and some of the computational things that we're building as we try to cover what's happening. So as we know, and as we've already said, the scale of what's happening is so vast that to be able to even think of it in terms of something that you can report on is difficult, because what we're seeing is like the evisceration of so many buildings, like so much destruction across Gaza. To be able to distill this or to think about it in a coherent way, to bring explanation, to bring clarity to it is difficult. So a lot of the media that we work with is what you've seen. We work with satellite imagery coming here from Planet, which provides this. And we're working with a lot of open source information from social media, and open source data that's provided by the United Nations, for example, the United Nations Satellite Center. So here we see, for example, one of the UN facilities that was used by displaced people to seek refuge. And we see how subsequently through satellite imagery, that entire place of refuge was cleared out by the Israeli military. Here we see a map of the scale of the attacks on residential infrastructure throughout the Gaza Strip. So just to emphasize again, what we've already said is that the scale of this is vast, and we have so much information coming in. How can we do something about that at all? At the same time, we're dealing with types of information that are difficult to map in a one-to-one or a linear way. We're dealing with information that's published by the Israeli military that's extremely deceptive, if not outright contradictory. A lot of the materials that we're looking through, it appears that they're directing people to go to places that are subsequently attacked. So a lot of what we've covered are the safe zones that are published by the Israeli military, ostensibly to direct people away from harm. But what we see, in fact, is these safe zones are being used as a tool to displace people, and also incidentally to move them into places that are subsequently targeted. So we're dealing with this amount of information, and also with types of information that is not very straightforward. It's contradictory and misleading. So how do we bring that all together? And as Sarah has talked about already, the pace of events that we're dealing with is so intense. As soon as we cover an attack that's happening on one hospital, like namely the Shifa hospital, which has been attacked consecutive times over and over again. As soon as we cover it, and there's one story about it, then it seems like people start to rebuild, and then there's another attack on it subsequently. And so the story almost is completely, superseded by new events that are happening on the ground. So as we're following and trying to keep up with the pace of the reports that are coming in, the information that's coming in, we also have information coming from different places that we want to be able to put in the same environment. And we're trying to be able to create reports that are dynamic. So when we're reporting on Shifa Hospital, for example, with this timeline, we try to create a report that can be a living document that can continue to grow over time. So as more reports come in, we can document those as a part of the platform, and that report can continue to grow instead of us, having to create a new story about it. So some of the work that we've done is presenting a kind of analysis of what's been happening through this invasion on medical infrastructure in Gaza. So what we've observed is a consistent pattern of disabling medical infrastructure. In fact, disabling many different types of infrastructure, including aid infrastructure, logistical infrastructure, political infrastructure. But in this specific report, we're looking at attacks on hospitals, which all reflect a kind of consistent pattern of, attacking the surroundings, attacking the hospital itself through strikes, and subsequently besieging the hospital, preventing any kind of supplies from getting in, and then occupying the hospital, forcing people out. So, of course, to get to some kind of analysis like this, to get to this kind of diagrammatic representation, it takes a lot of time to bring all of the information together and try to identify what's actually going on. And, so as well, when we look at the pattern of displacement that's happened by documenting the evacuation zones published by the Israeli military, and the subsequent flight of displaced people from northern Gaza, we have these kind of distilled diagrammatic representations, but in order to get at these, in the end, it takes some time to work with information. I'll slow down a little bit for the interpreters. Sorry, I realize I'm talking very fast. And another way that we try to represent this information is through three-dimensional environments, and I will talk a little bit about how we do that. So one of the main things that we try to do, again, as I've said, is try to build a technical infrastructure that is a place where not only we can present the information that's coming to us, but also is an environment where we can bring different types of media together, where we can see how media relates together. So I saw a question recently, a question was asked, how can you know whether or not what you're seeing is actually real? How can you know this information is legitimate? Well, one of the methods we use to do that is by looking at multiple types of media and seeing how that media comes together in the same environment. So you might have two different types of media that corroborate each other, maybe a report from a journalist from Al Jazeera, for example, and then additionally a testimony. We have these different sources of information coming from different places, and these corroborate each other. And part of what we try to do is develop a technical environment, a technical infrastructure where we can bring that information together and see how it relates together. And this is kind of a diagrammatic representation of how this happens. We have different types of media and data and reports that are coming in at all times. And we basically situate all of these reports together into what we call an image model complex, a complex of images, a complex of models, a complex of reporting. This is not an automatic process, of course. This is not like we just put the information in and then suddenly there's a story. We have researchers that are working with information, trying to figure out, we have researchers, writers, reporters, right, working with information, trying to figure out the key elements and trying to figure out where these media are situated, what is significant about them in the context. And then from there, we can use these platforms to basically present our reporting. So I think what I tried to emphasize here is that the way that we're presenting the information through these 3D models, through these websites that you can scroll, the way we present the information is also the way that we assemble the information. So we're trying to develop tools that can be used both to bring the information together and to tell a story about it. And Yeah, we would like to think that these types of tools can be made more and more accessible over time. We work with our colleagues in Ramallah at the Al-Haq investigation unit to try to develop these tools for different use cases. One of the things that we've been developing as well is we kind of started to work to make a system that we can use to document and visualize all the reports that are coming through about different events. So here, for example, we have a visualization of various reports coming from Arabic journalistic sources about attacks on hospitals, attacks on different hospitals here. So, for example, some of the reporting that's coming in is coming from Al Jazeera, some from Al Arabi News. And here we're not using this as the basis of our investigations. We're not saying like, oh, look, this journalist said it, that means it's true. It's more that we can keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening over time. So we can see, okay, how many reports were there at this time of something being out of service? How many reports were there at this time of being a strike? And we don't use that as the ground truth, but we kind of see that to get a sense of what are the types of patterns that are emerging throughout reporting. And as well, something that we try to do when we're making these systems is we try to make it so there's different ways that different researchers and different collaborators can come together to participate in building the report, doing the research, and eventually writing the story. So for me, I'm mostly working on the side of code. So I'm programming a lot of these interfaces, but we also have, we try to use environments like Notion, which is a note-taking app where researchers and reporters can come in and basically build out the writing that will accompany the different data elements that we've assembled together. So we have this kind of like scaffolded way of thinking about how to manipulate information for different people, for different types of expertise. And what this has kind of allowed us to do when we're talking about dealing with the pace of the information and the pace of reporting is we've been able to respond to events as they're happening, which is something that's important to us. This was basically almost exactly a year ago that the Israeli military killed this young man, Mohammed al-Saidi, in the Al-Aqsa compound. And they kind of made it out to be this mysterious circumstance where they didn't really know what happened. It wasn't caught on video. But what we were able to do with creating an image model complex of the videos and our 3D model of the compound is put these pieces together and start to see, okay, where were the cameras located? Where were these videos actually been taken to reconstruct what happened? And this kind of environment, this kind of environment for doing the research also became the way of presenting the research in the end too. So we're trying to think about the whole ecosystem of research and report together. And this is also the way that we continue to update the reporting on Al-Shifa Hospital, which has been invaded subsequent times, multiple times. So as more information comes through, we can put that back into this environment and then have that out for reporting. And as time goes on, we're assembling all of this information together, trying to put it into one environment where it can be accessible to more researchers, and hopefully making these tools more available is definitely the ideal. So I hope that wasn't too fast. I hope that was something. There's some aspect of that was useful or interesting. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Peter. That was very useful and very interesting. I think it showed us very clearly why investigation is so important in this conflict. And Peter there talked about the scale of the conflict, but also the scale of the information that's coming in and finding ways to get through that sort of overwhelming sense of information to get at what we feel is the truth, or as close to the truth that we can get, is something that investigative reporting and investigative journalism can do, or can make an attempt at least. I think the other thing that is really important from Peter's talk to think about is that each of our investigations, we build on what has gone before. So we build on each other, and the bringing all this information together and putting it out there provides building blocks for other investigators and other reporters to build on. And certainly Peter's work at Forensic Architecture there, we can really see from what he showed us how that can be done. I'm going to hand over to our third speaker now. Welcome, Phil Rees from Al Jazeera. Thank you.
Okay. Anyway, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Sarah and Peter. Indeed, fascinating stuff. And hello, everyone. And indeed, thank you to the GIJN for organizing this. Now, look, the news coverage from Gaza by my colleagues at Al Jazeera News and indeed others has been absolutely harrowing. And while barely watchable at times, I'm afraid it certainly was for me. It was essential viewing. Now, you know, what's happening in Gaza is that it's a sort of genocide being played out in real time. And we are getting images from there. But, you know, I've spent times in my career as a combat journalist for the BBC, but I've experienced nothing like this. And, you know, the bravery of those covering the news for me is absolutely beyond words. Now, when this started, I mean, I was watching the news glued to the TV, and I wondered, you know, what could we do as investigative journalists to contribute to the coverage? And, you know, I want today to perhaps look at this in a slightly, you know, theoretical way, look at it, you know, not about the details of what's been going on, but the approach that perhaps one should have as investigators, as distinct to covering and reporting on news. And now you might well ask, by the way, and this was touched on by Sarah, isn't all journalism investigative? And, you know, the role of every reporter is to pose questions and find things out. And in a sense, if you ask a question, you're kind of investigating a subject. And I'd say, I mean, the answer to that is, of course, yes, but I would also say no. There's a lot more to what I consider investigative journalism as a specialist genre. And of course, describing the world as it is does require some digging, and I accept there are, of course, gray areas. And, you know, you could say, you know, what's in a name? But, you know, unlike Shakespeare's Juliet in Verona, I think there actually is a lot in a name. And there are key differences between how I think people approach conventional journalism and how I think they should approach investigative journalism. Because we don't simply, in my view, perform the function of conventional journalism, but in greater depth. I don't think that's what we do. And I think the most prominent thing that we do is that we challenge established narratives, which often does come from news reports. And our first Gaza investigation came out as a 1-hour documentary called October 7, and we'll play the first clip from it. I'll read the script if you know it's here. Al Jazeera's investigative unit has carried out a forensic analysis of the events of October 7. The unit examined hours of footage, much of it taken from the head cams of dead Hamas fighters. It reviewed the testimonies of hundreds of survivors and compiled a comprehensive list of victims. It found widespread war crimes, but discovered that many of the most horrific stories were untrue. Now, I just wanted to set that up, and we often do at the beginning of documentaries that we make, you know, just set up that basic principle. And it's not, you know, particularly esoteric or complicated. But, you know, what you do tend to find is that, you know, news journalism tends to claim that it claims to present the world, an accurate reflection of the world kind of as it is. I mean, often terms like objectivity and balance is used, you know, in these kind of senses. And, you know, my view is that the investigative journalist believes that there's something wrong with the facts as presented by official sources. I mean, I'm not trying to, you know, undermine fine news journalists around the world. Don't get me wrong here. It's not that. But the aim of an investigation is to expose deceit and the spin and misconduct that is often reported, because, you know, a lot of people don't have the opportunity to question it. And that's where this investigation began, October 7. We saw headlines in newspapers that Hamas fighters had killed, 1,400 Israelis and others in a brutal and utterly inhuman fashion. Now, that a lot of that may be true, and I think certainly was true. But newspaper headlines in Europe, the US and Asia, I mean, it's absolutely worldwide. For days, we're screaming about sort of dead babies, systematic rape, evil terrorists. I mean, it was certainly one narrative that dominated certainly the Western media for about 3 to 4 days when this war started. So we decided ourselves to see, well, it just felt to me, not totally accurate anyway. So we decided to piece together what happened to the best of our ability, and found that even the Israeli media told a more complicated story. And hopefully play clip 2.
The Israeli newspaper Yediot Aharonot says that at midday, the army issues a version of what is known as the Hannibal Directive.
נוהל חניבל הוא נוהל בלתי פורמלי, שאומרת, אוקיי, עדיף לנו שהחייל ייהרג ושלא ייתפס חי.
The Hannibal Directive is the result of previous humiliations where Israel handed over hundreds of Palestinian prisoners in return for the release of one Israeli soldier.
הייתה הבנה שהתוצאה היותר טובה של תקרית כזאת זה חייל הרוג ולא חייל בשבי.
On October 7, it seems the Hannibal Directive may have been revived and applied even to civilian hostages.
The Air Force operated during those hours under an instruction to prevent movement from Gaza into Israel and return from Israel into Gaza. 70 vehicles were hit. At least in some of the cases, everyone in the vehicle was killed.
The Israeli military does not deny the report. Israeli first responders released footage of civilians burned in a car. The car was struck from above.
Well, to me, it's inexcusable for a helicopter or any weapon system to be engaging any target if you don't know what that target is. And the footage we're looking at here, which I find very disturbing, we have a lot of people here making their way back through the breach in the wire back into Gaza. Now, my concern is, with this footage, we cannot tell whether they're Hamas gunmen or civilians or possibly hostages. And I don't believe the helicopter pilot or the machine gun operator would be able to tell either.
So, I mean, after this, basically what we did was really something very simple. We collected evidence, most of it in the public domain, and put pieces of the jigsaw together to find out what the evidence says happened. It involved some OSINT work. I wish we had the resources that Peter's got. I'm very envious of forensic architecture and what they can do, but we had various attempts to do that. But it was more, honestly, elbow grease in going through public records and media output, especially the Israeli media output. Now, it's interesting that, of course, we didn't shy away also from the killings that Hamas fighters were involved in, and we came up with numbers and all of that, and certainly, they committed serious war crimes. So it wasn't in any way to try to mitigate the effect of what they did, but it was just to give a more complete picture of what happened on that day. Now, we've had we've had some criticism of that, but certainly from the Israeli side. But thinking about how we are as investigative journalists, I think that conventional reporting is a different mentality if you're reporting on that, because you usually are validated by how alike it is to other stories that are published or broadcast on the same subject, whereas an investigative story tends to challenge these accepted truths, and in a sense it'll provide evidence that what is assumed or commonly reported in the news is wrong or certainly needs adjustment. And here's some more of it in clip 3 from the film.
The I-Unit calculates that 1,154 Israelis and foreign nationals are killed on October 7 and in the days immediately afterwards. Of these, 256 are soldiers. 53 belong to the police and other security forces, and 63 are civilian security guards. The remaining 782 victims are unarmed. The I-Unit's list of the dead reveals that at least 18 are killed by Israeli ground troops. A number of other bodies are recovered from beneath rubble who died in circumstances that are unclear. In the days following October 7, journalists are shown around the kibbutzim by the Israeli army.
This is something that monsters do, not humans.
Hamas fighters and others committed crimes on October 7. The Israeli media, however, focuses not on the crimes they committed, but on crimes they did not.
I'm talking to some of the soldiers, and they say what they've witnessed as they've been walking through these different houses, these different communities. Babies, their heads cut off. That's what they said. No one could expect that it would be like this. The horrors that I'm hearing from these soldiers. As I mentioned earlier, about 40 babies at least were taken out on gurneys.
The I-Unit's list of the dead shows no babies were killed in Kfar Aza, the kibbutz this report came from. The story was nevertheless picked up by international media and repeated by President Biden.
I've been doing this a long time. I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children.
The White House later clarifies that actually, the president had not seen pictures of beheaded children. A senior Israeli military officer later speaks to journalists in front of a burnt-out house in Kibbutz Be'eri. It's the house where 12 hostages appear to have been killed during the assault by the Israeli police and army.
Inside this house were another 15 burned people, among them 8 babies in this corner. They were concentrated them, and they killed them, and they burned them. Well, did you see? I evacuated.
The list of the dead shows that there were no babies in the house. And Colonel Vach does not tell journalists that the casualties are almost certainly caused by Israeli forces.
Good. Well, thank you. I just, want to wrap up by saying that, the news from Gaza is heartbreaking. I mean, I'm sure we all feel that. And at the moment, we're getting reports from inside Gaza, and then we're getting denials, as we heard earlier from Sarah and others, or at least a different interpretation from the Israeli side. And, I think, again, we have a role to do as an investigator here, because in a way, news is happy to report 2 conflicting statements as evidence of balance. That's in a way what it does. The Israelis say this, the Palestinians say that. They report this, even though one of those statements must be untrue. I mean, they can't both be true, and therefore they're actually propagating a falsehood. But nevertheless, that's the way that we tend to look at, fairness in news. Now, the objective, in my view, of an investigation is to prove that one side is actually telling the truth, or at least partial truth, and the other is not, or indeed what is actually going on based on a scrupulous collection and assessment of evidence. Now, I'm proud of the work we've done in this unit, and we've had a real world effects, and that's another thing I think investigations should have in terms of. We have today, I've been dealing with it, we have 3 ongoing investigations taking place regarding police prosecutions. Cyprus, the UK, and South Africa. And, we've had very positive effects on what has gone on. And in France, for example, we contributed, according to the French Interior Minister, to the banning of a far-right group there. Now, I'm not saying that, trying to just claim, what we've done here. I'm trying to say that investigations can make a difference, and it's really, really important. And I think in Gaza, there is a huge duty, and there will continue to be a crucial role for investigative journalism to be able to tell the truth. And you don't have to be in there to do that, though, of course, it would be much better. Okay, that's all from me.
Thanks, Phil. Would you mind just muting yourself so we don't get any background sound? Thank you. Thank you very much for that, those thoughts. Some very difficult scenes there. A few very important points about investigators and investigative journalism having the privilege of time, being able to go out and question narratives. I think one of the big challenges of this conflict has been the polarization of the two sides, not just within Israel and Gaza, but on a worldwide scale. We saw Biden there in Phil's clip. So I think as investigators trying to find our way very carefully through use of language, but really questioning some of these narratives which are so strongly held by both sides is one of the key things that investigators and investigative journalism can do. And as we saw there from Phil, it really is worthwhile. It really is worth doing. We've got about 15 minutes left for questions. I see we've got quite a big queue of questions lined up. So it would be great to hear from some people out there, some of our audience. We've got a member of GIJN ready with your questions, Hallie Pate, who has been reading them as they've been coming in, and she's going to moderate them. So Holly, can I hand over to you?
Yep, sounds good. Thanks everybody for your inputs. Super interesting to hear everyone's insights, and we have some great questions from the audience. So the first question we have was directed at Sarah. So the question is, in such cases as this conflict, where the reporter can't be in the field to cover the news, and they depend a lot on citizen journalists, how do you fact check the information you're getting? And when you are relying on citizen journalism, is it safe to publish the name of the person who's sharing the story? So sort of a two-part question to Sarah.
Thank you. Definitely, that's the main challenge. And I think Peter touched on that a little bit in how you collect as many stories from the different perspective, from a different angle, from a different point of view. And I think in collecting testimonies from the ground, you just have to talk to as many people as you can, and you have to collect as many visual material. In the case of being remote, like working on this remotely, you just have to find different angles from the same story, try to corroborate it with someone else who was there, talk to a doctor, talk to an eyewitness, a neighbor. So it really is just putting in the calls and trying to find as many ways of telling that story as possible. And I think on the safety of the citizen journalist, it is something that we deal with every day. Sometimes you first of all you ask the person, but then I think you also have to decide on the risk and whether it is worth putting that person's name out there if you think that they may be in danger. So I think it's a thing you figure out every day. There is no formula, although of course it's preferred to have people with names in stories, but in this conflict it's been a question that we had to deal with all the time, and something to assess depending on the context or the situation.
Okay, great. Definitely makes sense on a case-by-case basis. This next question was for Peter. So you obviously have complex research, evidence collection, and modeling capacity at Forensic Architecture. But what lessons and tips have you learned that can help journalists specifically in this collection?
For journalists specifically, one of the questions as I was looking through them a second ago was this question about what to prioritize. And of course, that's a constant concern for us at all times, and that shifts constantly. So I think, not being a journalist myself, but doing kind of investigative work, I think that one of the good things that forensic architecture affords is like a space to be able to raise different ideas about the different things that are happening, and to have a discussion about what are the the political stakes and the journalistic stakes and like the evidentiary stakes of each of the reports that are coming in. So I think, you know, it's hard for me to give like tips, like concrete tips outside of something that's technical, but I think that it can be valuable to have a kind of to take a step back and think about everything that's happening as a larger picture instead of trying to just, you know, report on a story or report on a headline. I think that, you know, especially towards the beginning of things that we were seeing, you know, there's so much reporting around the Al-Ahli hospital strike. And there's like a point where, you know, we had to extricate ourselves from that, because though we were continuing to do research about it, at a certain point, the scale of what's happening is so much larger than one hospital. You know, though the discourse may make it seem like it's about one location, like what's happening is so much vaster. So I think it's really, it's you know, the importance of being able to take a step back and also having an environment that can facilitate these conversations where you're not just going straight ahead to make a specific report on a headline. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
definitely. Sorry,
if I can
yeah, of
jump
course.
on Peter, on the first part of the question for Peter. I mean, I think one of the tips I would say is that you can always try to work with organizations like Peter's as a journalist, and then they'll help you with the more complicated environment. It's always been great to kind of foster these kind of collaboration, and I find they were very useful, and they come up with like that pooling of resources as I was saying. Thanks. Sorry for jumping.
No, absolutely. Thanks for saying. Yeah, we have a lot of, you know, we do certain things well, but we also depend on other people in the community to bring that expertise, of course. So yeah, it's a collaborative process across different organizations.
And I think to add from my perspective, what I've seen and the things that I've worked on here at The Guardian, it is collaboration within your newsroom as well, collaborating with other journalists and colleagues, because I think this is so much bigger than one person, and these stories are so much bigger than one person can do and get their head around. There's so much material, and just being able to prioritize is something that you can do much better if you do that together collaboratively, because you can discuss and have those conversations about what's the most important here.
Definitely. And in relation to what you started about hospitals in specific, we have a very specific question for you, Peter, on how you and your team are distinguishing between tactical disabling of hospitals for military operations, which is what the IDF alleges, and doing it to deliberately target medical infrastructure. Is there any way to disprove that allegation?
Yeah, so of course, this is something we've been covering from the very beginning. And when we immediately saw attacks on hospitals, there was nothing that we could particularly assess about why that was happening. Like in the first instances, like the first hospitals that were put offline. But over time, you know, what we saw is first we saw one type of attack, which was one where there is some kind of evacuation zone, some military conflict zone that's established, and that's then used as the justification for then invading a hospital. But then, of course, we see in other cases, in other hospitals where there's no such warning or there's no such announcement, and yet the hospital is invaded anyway. So we start to see these kind of tensions. And it's really looking at the way that the hospitals are invaded over time and consecutively and repeatedly that we start to get a sense of why this is happening. So, you know, for example, Shifa is a place that has had so much attention to it. You know, it's a place where, you know, the initial attack on the Al-Shifa hospital was attributed to it being a place where there's like Hamas infrastructure, underground tunnels, all this kind of stuff. And, you know, what we see is, okay, there was the first attack there. There were people that were killed. The whole hospital was disabled, like medical infrastructure disabled. And, you know, many people would say, okay, well, that was because of the Hamas infrastructure, right? But then what we see again is that the hospital was invaded a second time as soon as there was like some more medical infrastructure that came back there. And then it's invaded a third time again, right? So we see it happen again and again. That initial excuse is no longer applicable, but it's still what's in kind of like the collective consciousness of the discourse, right? It's like that was already reported. So maybe it seems like, okay, now Shifa is already corrupted as being this thing. But we see the attacks on people. We see the mass graves that have been set up there. We see the exhuming of bodies, taking them out of graves. So really, if you're paying attention to what's happening, you see that it's a much larger picture than this. If you follow the story all the way through all the events, then you can get an idea of how much further this goes than that, if that makes sense. So I hope that answers. It's a very difficult question to respond to because we're dealing with so many different hospitals, so many different situations, but yeah, I think that the scale of what's happening is very intense and very unprecedented.
Definitely. And speaking of big picture, last but certainly not least, we have another question for Phil. So in this conflict and just globally with elections, disinformation is obviously a topic of global concern right now. So for Phil, how do you sort through disinformation in relation to this conflict? Do you have specific tools you and your team use to help sort this, or other strategies?
I mean, it's a big challenge. I think it's an increasing challenge when you're going to get things like deep fake coming on for videos. But yeah, we get fake documents coming through that are sent to us. I mean, in terms of this conflict, obviously we saw and exposed some of the misinformation that was presented. I mean, I don't think there's any one silver bullet. No, there isn't. I mean, we just have to put the rigors of, journalistic evidence. And I think that's something we all do, and, we can do it in various ways. Obviously, there are various, OSINT tools that we can try to use that, obviously, forensic architecture use a lot of, but, whether it's, geolocation, we can look, use satellite imagery, we can, try and find out in those kind of ways. But, there's still old-fashioned reporting. You can just talk to people, find sources. And I think the important thing is to try to set out and say, well, what hypothesis are we making? What are we trying to say here? What are we trying to prove? And do we have enough evidence to publish this? And, that's the way I want people here to work. And in a way, in the end of the day, it's not actually me that decides that, it's our lawyers. I say, and it's like, if we went to court, can we support this? And, obviously in some cases, we certainly would never publish without having a pretty solid belief that we would win this in court. And in fact, we've had several sort of legal cases, but as I say, everything's fallen down. And while this unit has been here for the last decade, certainly we've not published something, but it's always something I'm, if anything keeps me awake at night, that's one of them.
Definitely makes sense. So one last question that's open to all of our panelists. What are some of the big stories or areas of inquiry that investigative journalists are missing without access to the ground? Which might be a larger question for everyone to think about.
Perhaps that's the problem.
Yeah.
How do we know what we don't know? I think that's one of the big questions of this conflict. We heard from, I think it was Peter earlier, about how to prioritize, the amazing tool that they were building, which assesses all the information that comes in, so they can get a sense of what are the big themes here, what are the subjects here, but actually trying to work a way through all the information and the scale of this thing, we keep saying over and over again over this past hour, to get at what don't we know that we need to know. I think that is one of the big questions.
Well, if I just chip in there, just for my thoughts on it, and it was staggering that, in a way, this happened on October 7, and I think that, coming out of the Israeli government, what went on, what decisions were made, how this was handled, will be coming out at some time. It's not information that you can deal with very easily without having, strong, sources within the Israeli, maybe defense establishment and government. But, I think there are so many unanswered questions, actually. So, yeah, I mean, I oddly enough think more of them are to do with, from the Israeli side than the Palestinian side.
I think I'd like to question the human shield theory. I think that's what we hear all the time. And I think not being on the ground makes it very difficult to respond to that. Kind of to assess what military, what military target may have been in the area, or why were people there? Why was this apartment building necessarily bombed? I mean, I think this is the kind of blanket answer to most airstrikes, is that this was a human shield situation, or this is a civilian casualty. And I think not being on the ground and not having the resources on the ground that can go around chasing every single strike. So again, it's basically the scale of it, and just not being there makes me miss a lot of stories, I think.
Yeah, I would say that even with any kind of working with people on the ground, like we talked about the necessity of anonymity to protect people, like how that's needed for safety. Like because of that, because of the level of danger, we almost, we miss this kind of very deep, like personal qualitative aspect to the work, where we can do this kind of high level analysis of showing like the amount of attacks, but to go down to really deal with like somebody's personal testimony of what's happened and how that relates to the surveillance architecture or the borders that are being set up, to follow that almost becomes impossible as a kind of militarized censorship. So that seems like what we're really missing in this case compared to other work. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all for your answers and your time. Since we are going a little bit over, I'm going to pass it back to Rachel to wrap us up.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks for your great moderating there. And thank you to everyone for your questions. Unfortunately, as Holly said, we are out of time today, but I hope that you have found this an interesting and engaging hour. A quick reminder of GIJN's next webinar that will be held on the 14th of May at 9 a.m. ET, and they will be looking at investigating the extractives industry in Africa, another big, very interesting area to talk about. You can register for that through the link in the chat box, so that should be at the bottom of your screen. That leaves me just to thank GIJN for all their hard work. And there's been a lot of work behind the scenes, getting the speakers, setting this up, dealing with some very big tech issues 5 minutes before we were due to go live. So thanks for making this, as always, as smooth and brilliant as ever. And a very, very big thank you to our three speakers, Peter, Sarah, and Phil. Do check out their work at Al Jazeera, Forensic Architecture, and AP, Associated Press. And also check out the work of my colleagues at The Guardian. We've done a lot of this work too, so as have many other media outlets. So that's it from me now. Finally, just one thing to say, GIJN's Twitter feed at GIJN, and the website will hold details of all future events. Thanks for listening in. Bye.